The rain had turned to something meaner than rain by the time we crossed into the northern pass, and I remember thinking the mountain road looked like a black ribbon someone had thrown carelessly across the peaks. I was 2 hours behind schedule, a folder of testimony sliding across the passenger seat, my driver Tomas gripping the wheel with the tension of a man who has driven this road 100 times and still doesn't trust it. We were following the royal convoy's route by coincidence, several minutes behind the armored cars carrying Queen Aurelia Veyne back from a factory inspection. I had spent the day arguing with regional officials about designation-based hiring quotas. I had not expected the day to end with me climbing down a mountainside in the freezing dark. The convoy's taillights vanished around a bend, and then, through the sheeting rain, I saw them scatter sideways, red light smearing across wet asphalt like something torn open. Tomas swore and hit the brakes. Metal screamed against metal, then a long, grinding silence that felt worse than the noise had. "Commissioner, wait for security." I wasn't listening. Smoke was rising from the black slope below the broken guardrail, thin and gray against the rain, and something in me that had nothing to do with policy or protocol simply moved. I went down the embankment in shoes never made for mud, catching branches, hearing radios crackle above me as royal guards began shouting into the dark. The Queen's car had left the road and wedged itself against a stand of pines, its front end folded like paper. The security vehicle behind it had struck a boulder, swerving to avoid the wreck, and lay tilted in the ditch, its horn stuck in one unbroken note. I reached the Queen's car first. The rear door had buckled inward, and I cut my palm open, forcing my fingers into the gap and hauling it wide enough to see inside. An engine alarm screamed under the crumpled hood. Broken glass glittered across the seats like frost, and there, still belted in, blood tracking from a cut near her temple, was Aurelia Veyne, alive, furious, trying to give orders to a car that could no longer hear her. "Someone get this door. I need the security channel. She stopped when she saw me. Her whole face changed, the fury draining out and something raw and unguarded rushing in to take its place. "Leo?" I froze. Nobody had called me that since we were 23 and hiding from a state dinner in a library that smelled of old paper and candle smoke. She reached for my wrist instead of arguing, which frightened me more than the smoke did, because Aurelia Veyne did not reach for things. She commanded them to come to her. Her fingers closed around me like I was the only fixed point in a world that had come loose from its moorings. "You're my mate," she said, half to herself, as though testing whether the sentence would hold weight. "You came for me. You always." Her eyes lost focus. She swayed against the belt. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. "Don't move," I said, because it was the only true thing available to me. "You're pinned. Help is coming." She did not let go of my wrist. Not when the medics finally broke through. Not when they cut the belt free. Not until they lifted her onto the stretcher, and her grip finally slackened into unconsciousness. Just before her eyes closed, she murmured something about glass ceilings and winter light, something that meant nothing to the paramedic beside me, and everything to the part of me that remembered a conservatory on the academy grounds, and a kiss neither of us had spoken of again in 9 years. I did not know, kneeling in the mud with my hand bleeding into my sleeve, how much of those 9 years had gone missing from behind her eyes. I only knew that the woman who had spent the last 6 months publicly dismantling my career in front of the entire kingdom had just called me by a name that belonged to a different life, and that some traitorous, unkillable part of me had answered to it instantly. She was flown by helicopter to the private medical wing of Care Veyne, while I was still being questioned by security officers who could not decide whether I was a witness, a hazard, or something else entirely. In the end, I rode behind the ambulance in an unmarked car, because nobody thought to stop me, and I did not think to ask permission. I told myself I was there because the investigators would need my account. I did not examine that lie very closely. I had gotten good at not examining certain things, where Aurelia was concerned. She woke 14 hours later, and I was still there, folded into a hard chair in the family waiting room, because I had not yet been formally released as a witness, and, if I am honest, because I could not make myself want to be. Dr. Celine Orris, the royal physician, met me in the corridor before I was allowed in. Silver-streaked hair, a flat, careful voice that had clearly delivered difficult news for 30 years. She has sustained a traumatic retrograde memory loss, Dr. Celine said. Her reasoning is intact, her language, her medical knowledge, her sense of protocol, all intact, but her autobiographical memory has a gap, approximately 9 years. I did not understand, at first, what that meant in practice. I understood very quickly once I stood in the doorway of her recovery room and she looked up from a tangle of monitor wires and saw me, and her entire body seemed to unclench in front of a room full of strangers she did not recognize as belonging to her own life. "There you are," she said, and reached for me exactly as she had reached for my wrist on the mountainside. "Why are you standing all the way over there?" "I'm giving you space," I said carefully. She frowned, genuinely confused, the way you frown at a sentence that is grammatically correct but makes no sense. Her gaze dropped to my bare hands, then to her own throat, searching for a mark that wasn't there, and I watched confusion curdle into fear. "You're my mate," she said again. Not a claim this time, not an order, but a fact she was only now realizing might not be a fact at all, the way the floor might not be solid, the instant after you've already put your weight on it. The room went very quiet. Senior aides, a security captain, palace physicians, everyone looking at me. "We're not," I said, as gently and as clearly as I could manage, because gentleness would not undo the truth, and clarity was the only kindness I had to offer her. "We were never bonded. We're not married. We are not, currently, anything like that." For a moment, she looked at me as though waiting for the joke to land. Then she saw my face, and I watched something in her crack open, a fine fracture of grief moving across features that had not, in 6 months of public life, been permitted to show grief at all. "Then what happened?" she said, her voice unsteady. "Between us." And I had no answer for her, because the true answer was too large and too painful to hand a woman with a bleeding head wound and half her life missing. She never got to finish asking. A wave of dizziness took her pulse spiking on the monitor, and beneath it, I caught the change in her scent. The cool bergamot and white pepper leaf I remembered from years ago, sharpening into something colder, more mineral, like snow about to become an avalanche. 2 guards moved forward on instinct. I told them to stop before I had decided to say anything at all, and they stopped, because apparently in this new configuration of the world, my voice counted for something in a room full of people sworn to protect the crown. "Don't leave," Aurelia said, only to me, her hand finding mine again with the same unthinking certainty. Dr. Celine pulled me into the corridor afterward and laid the diagnosis out with the patient tone of a woman who expects to be resisted. "Trauma," she explained, "can turn a familiar person into an anchor. The brain, faced with 9 years of missing context, reaches for whatever still makes sense of the world, and old feelings, unfinished feelings," she said, watching my face carefully as she said it, "can fuse with instinct and fear into something that, from the inside, feels indistinguishable from certainty." "It doesn't mean what she feels isn't real," Dr. Celine said. "It only means it isn't informed. There's a difference, Commissioner, and I think you already know it better than most people in this palace." I did know it. I had spent 6 years of my career building an entire body of law around exactly that distinction between what people feel and what they are entitled, legally and ethically, to decide while feeling it. I was not going to abandon every principle I had ever fought for the moment it became personally inconvenient, the moment the person testing it was the one woman I had never quite managed to stop loving. So I made myself a promise in that corridor, the smell of antiseptic and rain-damp wool still in my nose, and I kept it far more stubbornly than either of us expected. I would not let her call me her mate while she believed a lie her own injured mind had built to survive the missing years. I would not wear a ring I hadn't earned, sleep in a bed I hadn't chosen, or answer to a title that belonged to a woman I wasn't. I would stay, because the doctors believed my presence steadied her, and because some part of me I was not yet ready to name wanted to stay regardless. but I would stay on my own terms, boundaries fully intact, or I would not stay at all. When I returned and told her some version of this, the parts I could put into words without it costing me everything, she looked at me with an expression I would come to know very well over the following weeks. The look of a brilliant woman doing her best to accept a rule she disliked, because the person delivering it had already earned her trust in a life she couldn't remember living. "I understand that you're telling me we are not together," she said slowly. "We're not. But my entire body behaves as if coming closer to you is remembering something." "Bodies remember feelings," I told her. "That doesn't make them permission." She considered that with the same gravity she'd once brought to constitutional arguments in our university seminars, testing the words for weaknesses, and then, astonishingly, she nodded. "All right," she said. "Then I will have to earn whatever it is I already seem to believe I have." I did not know yet how literally she meant that. They kept her isolated in the medical wing for the first several days, shielded from anything resembling political stress, and because I registered to her as familiar without triggering fear, Dr. Celine asked, more than once, visibly reluctant, aware of exactly what she was asking, whether I would remain nearby. I told myself it was a professional courtesy. I told myself a great many things, in those early days, that I did not have the courage to examine. What I discovered in that strange suspended interval was that the woman I had known at the academy was still in there, buried under 9 years of Queen, and that grief and wonder could apparently occupy the same hour without canceling each other out. She hated the bedroom that had been redesigned after her coronation, all pale marble and gilt trim, and said so with the same blunt disdain she'd once turned on a professor's lecture notes. She could not understand why her own closet held 12 nearly identical black formal coats, arranged with military precision, as though a version of herself she didn't recognize had decided joy was a security risk. She was horrified, genuinely, theatrically horrified, to discover she now drank her coffee black. "Who did this to me?" she demanded, staring at the offending cup like it had personally betrayed her. "You did," I said. "Somewhere around year 3 of your reign, you apparently decided sugar was a weakness. That's absurd. Sugar is a birthright." She still remembered exactly how I took my tea. Too much honey, no milk. Which was a small, ordinary fact, and it still managed to undo me a little. 3 nights later, standing in the doorway of the palace kitchens at 2 a.m, because I had found her there in a borrowed sweater, trying and failing to locate bread that did not arrive under a silver dome. "They moved everything," she said, betrayed, rifling through cabinets that had apparently been reorganized sometime during her reign, without consulting the parts of her memory she still had access to. "I know where the ovens used to be. I do not know where they are now." "You renovated this kitchen in your 4th year," I said, leaning in the doorway, unable to keep the smile off my face. There was an entire segment on the evening news about it. Marble countertops. A great deal of fuss about the marble countertops specifically. Why would I renovate a kitchen I clearly never use? You'd have to ask the version of you who did it. She gave me a look, dry, put upon, entirely familiar, and for 10 minutes, hunting through drawers for a toaster relocated twice since she last remembered it, we were simply 2 women bickering in a kitchen at an unreasonable hour. The same 2 women who used to sneak out of formal dinners to argue about philosophy over cold chips at a cafe near the academy gates. She still folded book corners despite what I would later learn were years of outraged royal librarians. She still hated pears with a passion that seemed disproportionate to a piece of fruit. She still slept badly before thunderstorms, and still remembered, without being told, the ridiculous private hand signal we had invented at 19 to escape boring conversations. 2 fingers tapped twice against the wrist, meaning "rescue me now." She used it on me twice that week, in the middle of medical briefings she found tedious, and both times I had to leave the room to keep from laughing. Then a guard rounded the corner, saw her standing barefoot on cold tile at 2 a.m, and said, "Your Majesty, is everything all right?" And the illusion collapsed at once, her spine straightening, her face rearranging itself into the composed mask I had watched her wear on every broadcast for 6 years. Later that same week, sitting across from me on a low couch in her private study, with a blanket around her shoulders because the headaches made her cold. She asked, without any preamble at all, "Did I become terrible?" I could have lied. It would have been easy, and she would have believed me completely, because in that moment she trusted me more than any living person. I didn't. "No," I said. "You became powerful. Sometimes you forgot those aren't the same thing." She was quiet a long time, turning the words over the way she used to turn over difficult legal arguments, testing them for a flaw, and I watched something settle into her features that looked less like relief and more like resolve. It was her own idea, days later, to ask for the recordings. Every speech, every negotiation, every crisis she had no memory of surviving, and I made no attempt to talk her out of it, though I could have. We watched hours of footage together in the private study, the curtains drawn against a gray afternoon, state funerals where she stood dry-eyed and immaculate, while grief moved visibly through everyone around her, international negotiations where she outweighed hostile diplomats simply by refusing to fill silence, a security crisis in the Capitol where she calmly ordered an evacuation while 3 advisors argued about optics in the background, a widely shared clip of her demolishing an Alpha minister who had mocked an Omega civil servant in open session, her voice never once rising, every sentence a scalpel. She watched that one with something like grim pride and asked me to replay it twice. Then the archive reached the confrontation from 6 months earlier, and I nearly reached for the remote to skip it. I didn't. Skipping it would have been its own kind of lie. On screen, present-day Aurelia, composed, merciless, magnificent in the way only cruelty dressed as reason can be magnificent, dismantled every argument I had made against the household registration reform, a bill requiring expanded documentation for permanent mate bonds, framed publicly as an anti-trafficking measure. I had warned in that chamber that it would make it trivially easy for employers and insurers to identify bonded Omegas and discriminate accordingly. She had called my objections sentimental, naive, dangerously behind the times, and the cameras caught me afterward walking alone out of the chamber, my face arranged into the flat calm I had trained myself to wear for exactly these moments. Beside me on the couch, amnesiac Aurelia went very still and very pale. "Why?" she said, when the clip ended, her voice unsteady in a way I had never once heard in 6 years of watching her in public. "Did you stay in this palace after I did that to you?" "Because the woman who did that doesn't remember doing it," I said, "and I refuse to punish you for something you literally cannot recall." I made myself hold her gaze. "That doesn't mean I've forgiven the woman you'll be again, once your memory comes back." She flinched. Not visibly, not in any way 6 years of cameras had trained her to hide, but I had spent enough hours in that room with her by then to see it anyway, a small internal recoil, and I understood, watching it happen, that some part of her had begun to fear her own recovery, not because she wanted to remain lost, because she was afraid the woman capable of that broadcast would stop wanting to hold my hand across a blanket at 2 in the morning. She asked, a few days later, to see the academy. Dr. Celine resisted, then relented under carefully managed conditions. Minimal security, a short window, no press anywhere near the grounds. We drove out under gray skies to the campus where we had both once been 20-something women pretending the future could wait, and she walked, without needing directions, straight to the old glass conservatory at the edge of the botanical gardens, half its roof damaged by some long-ago winter storm, most of its rarer plants relocated years before, ivy climbing in through the broken panes as though the building had decided to grow itself a new occupant. She stood in the doorway a long moment before going in. "I remember pieces," she said. "Not all of it. You stealing my scarf, because you said royal children shouldn't be allowed to hoard the only nice one in the building. Arguing with me about the future of the monarchy until one of us started laughing instead of finishing the sentence. Dancing, once, with no music, because you refused to let me sulk in silence about an exam. You remember the kiss," I said. It wasn't a question. Her eyes found mine. "I remember telling you I wished I could choose one thing in my life without considering Valedria first. I remember you crying afterward, because you knew we couldn't start something we'd have to hide." "I wanted you," I admitted. because there seemed no point lying to a woman standing in the wreckage of the place where it had all begun. Then, "Do you want me now?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, not honestly. Not without breaking every boundary I had built for exactly this kind of moment. She read the silence correctly and did not push, did not close the distance between us, though I watched the wanting move visibly across her face like weather. "I know you're not my mate," she said instead, quietly. "I know I have no right to ask you to become one. But this is the first thing I've felt since waking that doesn't seem borrowed from a memory I can't access. I wanted you to know that, whatever else turns out to be true." I told her I heard her. I did not tell her what it cost me to leave that conservatory without closing the distance myself. While I navigated the impossible arithmetic of my own heart, Captain Eleanor Rusk, Aurelia's chief of security, a blunt, methodical beta woman with 20 years in royal protection, was doing arithmetic of her own, and what she found troubled her enough to bring it to me rather than the ordinary palace chain of command. The Queen's usual mountain route had been altered 11 minutes before departure, on the night of the crash. The change authorized through a legitimate palace account belonging to a level of clearance held by very few people. A mechanical review turned up deliberate interference with the car's electronic braking module, not sabotage crude enough to guarantee a crash, Eleanor explained, spreading photographs of scorched circuitry across the desk between us, but engineered to make one significantly more likely on a bad road, in bad weather, at speed. The security vehicle behind Aurelia's car had been tampered with in the same way. "Somebody wanted an incident," Eleanor said, in a meeting that felt like it belonged to a colder, harder story than the one I had been quietly living inside the palace walls. I don't yet know if they wanted her dead or simply wanted her out of commission long enough to matter. I asked her why she was telling me, instead of the Queen's own private secretary, or the Minister of Justice, or anyone whose job it technically was. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, turning a photograph of the scorched circuit board over in her hands. "Because whoever authorized that route change had legitimate palace credentials," she said finally, "which means it was someone with access to the Queen's own household. I don't yet know who I can trust in that building, Commissioner. I know I can trust you, because you keep telling her things she doesn't want to hear, and people who lie for a living don't do that." It was not a compliment exactly, but I understood it as one, and I told her I would help however I could without compromising my own office's independence, and she said that was exactly the answer she'd hoped for. It mattered a great deal, because under Valedrian law, a monarch found temporarily incapacitated could be placed under a regency council, and the person most visibly pressing for exactly that outcome was Chancellor Melis Dorn, 56, an alpha who had served 3 monarchs and helped shape the very winter queen I had spent 6 public months opposing. Melis was not cartoonish in her ambition. She believed, with real and unshakable conviction, that the crown survived on discipline, that sentiment was a luxury the institution could not afford, and she had spent 9 years teaching Aurelia to believe precisely the same thing. She did not appear to hate me so much as fear what I represented at the Queen's elbow, a living reminder that power has a human cost. It was Melis, or someone loyal to her, who leaked the story. Word spread within hours that the Queen believed her mate was a civic official with no royal blood and a public record of criticizing the crown, and the headlines wrote themselves overnight. The Queen's secret Omega. Who is Liora Senn? Did the palace conceal a bond for years? My own commission's independence became a liability by morning. Critics on every channel accusing me of manipulating an injured alpha for influence, other voices insisting that if I truly were her mate, I ought to be granted formal authority during her recovery. I refused both narratives in a 2-minute statement outside my own apartment building, my hands steady though my stomach was not. I was not the Queen's mate. She was recovering from a serious injury. Our private medical circumstances would not become political theater. I would not accept royal authority, now or ever, under any circumstances. Melis found me 2 days later in a quiet corridor off the medical wing and offered, with the smooth courtesy of someone who has made this kind of offer many times before, a deal. Leave the palace, deny any history with Aurelia publicly, support the Regency Council. In exchange, My commission would receive funding it had been fighting for since I took the post. Funding that would let me do more good in a year than I'd managed in 5. I told her no. Not because I wanted Aurelia for myself, though God knew that was tangled somewhere inside the refusal, but because trading a recovering woman's medical autonomy for political convenience would have made a lie of everything I had built my career defending. "You'll regret this, Commissioner," Malus said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than a threat would have been. "I've regretted worse things for better reasons," I told her, and walked away before she could see how badly my hands were shaking. Aurelia, for her part, remained sharper than anyone gave her memory-damaged mind credit for. She could still read a briefing cover to cover and find the flaw in it before her own advisors did. What she lacked was context, the accumulated trust of 9 years that told her which advisors to believe and which to watch. And in the absence of that context, she leaned, more and more, on my willingness to disagree with her. "If I ordered you to stay," she asked me once, testing, over a dinner neither of us had touched, "would you?" "No," I said. She smiled, faint and genuine. The first real smile I'd seen from her in longer than I wanted to admit. Good. Why good? Because everyone else in this palace keeps saying yes. I find I no longer trust anyone who says yes to me automatically. There was a night, not long after, when the crash returned to her in a nightmare violent enough to flood the medical wing with the sharp, cold edge of her scent. Guards moving toward her door on instinct before I stopped them, aware that a room full of unfamiliar alphas would only worsen her panic. Dr. Celine asked her, gently, through the half-open door, what she wanted, and she said my name, only my name, nothing more. I found her on the floor beside her own bed, knees drawn up, shaking, furious at herself for the staff who had seen her lose control in front of them. I sat several feet away and let her ask, in a small voice that belonged to someone much younger than the Winter Queen, whether she might come closer. I said yes. She asked whether she might rest her head against my shoulder. I said yes to that too. We sat like that while the storm outside worked itself out, her scent slowly settling from raw panic back into something warmer, parchment and mountain air, and every instinct in my Omega body wanted to turn into her, to scent her back, to give her the comfort she was silently asking for with every line of her body. I held her hand instead and let that be enough, and it was one of the most intimate hours of my entire life, and neither of us spoke of it again for weeks. It was Eleanor who recovered the encrypted tablet from the wreck, biometric lock to Aurelia alone, brought to me first because Eleanor had learned, in a short time, exactly whose judgment she trusted in that palace. What it contained, once Aurelia unlocked it with a shaking thumbprint, upended everything I thought I understood about the woman who had gutted my argument on national television. Buried in draft files, time-stamped and revised obsessively over months, was a sweeping reform titled the Free Bond Charter. It restricted government access to bond records. It banned employers from demanding bond status except in narrowly defined safety cases. It penalized coercive bonding with real teeth for the first time in the kingdom's history. It guaranteed Omega's independent property rights after permanent bonds, stripped away the archaic royal statutes granting a monarch's mate ceremonial constitutional power, and repealed, specifically and by name, the exact harmful clauses of the household registration reform I had fought against in public and lost. She had drafted the entire thing in total secrecy, told no one, not even her closest aides, and had apparently intended to announce it within days of the crash. The charter ran to nearly 200 pages, dense with the kind of careful, unglamorous drafting that never makes headlines but changes how ordinary people are actually treated by the systems meant to protect them. Clauses on employer disclosure limits, on insurance underwriting, on the specific bureaucratic loopholes that had let the old registration reform be weaponized in exactly the way I'd predicted, each one annotated in the margins with small, precise notes in Aurelia's own handwriting, arguments with herself, dates, cross-references to testimony I recognized as my own from committee hearings she had publicly dismissed. I read it twice through, sitting on the edge of her hospital bed, and I was furious before I let myself be moved. If she had known I was right, if she had already been building the correction in private, Why let me be destroyed on television for saying it out loud? I don't have that answer yet, she admitted, watching my face. I will find it. I promise you I will find it. In the meantime, there were gentler days to survive, and I let myself have them, one at a time, refusing to think too hard about what it meant that I wanted them. There was a walk through the winter garden where she shed her entire security detail out of pure Academy-era stubbornness, ducking behind a hedge like a teenager, and I scolded her the whole way back to the gate while she laughed harder than I had heard her laugh in 9 years. There was the discovery, in a locked desk drawer she'd forgotten existed, of a scholarship photograph of me from university, the edges gone soft from years of handling, tucked behind a stack of unrelated correspondence, as though she'd needed it close, but hadn't wanted anyone to ask why. There was a box of every letter I had ever written her at university, preserved in careful chronological order, ribbon-tied, kept for 9 years, by a woman who had spent 6 of those months publicly declaring me naive on national television. There was an afternoon she asked, with genuine bewilderment, whether people truly chose romantic partners now, by swiping photographs left and right on a phone, and I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my tea across the very expensive rug, and she declared, with wounded royal dignity, that monarchy was clearly the more sensible system for finding a partner. And I told her monarchy had historically had a far worse track record than any application ever invented, arranged marriages and political disasters going back centuries, and she conceded the point with visible reluctance and considerable grace. There was an argument, sharper than the others, about whether she was fit to work at all, while her headaches persisted. She insisted the kingdom could not simply pause while she recovered, that ministers were already circling, that appearing idle would hand Mélès exactly the narrative she wanted. I told her that collapsing at her own desk would hand Mélès a far better one, and that stubbornness dressed up as duty was still just stubbornness. "You don't understand what it costs to look weak," she snapped, and I snapped back that I understood perfectly well, that I had spent 6 months being called naive and sentimental in front of the entire country, and had not once been permitted the luxury of appearing weak either. We were both right, and both furious, and it took the better part of an hour and a pot of tea gone cold before either of us was willing to say so. It ended with her reading policy briefs aloud to me in the low evening light, because screens made her head ache, and falling asleep halfway through a paragraph on agricultural subsidies with her head against the arm of the couch, her voice trailing into silence mid-sentence. I covered her with a blanket and stood there far longer than the task required, furious at how natural the tenderness felt, furious at myself for how badly I wanted to stay standing there all night. At a formal dinner attended by a handful of trusted ministers, she reached to pull out my chair from pure old habit before catching herself halfway through the motion, aware suddenly of every eye at the table. I sat down anyway, deliberately, unhurried, daring anyone present to comment on it. Nobody did. I noticed, though, that Mélès was watching from the far end of the table, with an expression I did not like at all. There was an afternoon Eleanor arranged, against every instinct in her security training, a short outing to a small cafe near the academy gates, where Aurelia and I had once spent hours arguing over cold chips and cheap coffee. The owner, an elderly beta woman who had run the place since before either of us was born, recognized neither of us at first, and for the length of 1 cup of tea, Aurelia sat with her collar turned up and her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, unrecognized, unbothered, simply a woman across a table from someone she loved. She asked the owner for the same order she used to have at 23, without needing to be reminded what it was, and when the woman finally realized who she was serving, Aurelia asked her, with unusual gentleness, not to say anything to anyone, and the woman agreed, and kept her word, and I have never forgotten the quiet dignity of that small mercy. There was a trip on the royal train to the coast for a ribbon cutting neither of us wanted to attend, hours of countryside sliding past dark windows, and somewhere around midnight, with her advisors asleep 3 cars back, Aurelia admitted she had never once, in 9 years of crossing the kingdom by rail, looked out the window instead of reading briefings. We sat together and watched the coastline appear at dawn, and she told me it was the first sunrise she could remember actually seeing, rather than simply scheduling around. There was also an afternoon outside the northern courthouse, weeks into the public frenzy over the leaked medical records, when a small crowd of protesters pressed close to Aurelia's car as she stepped out for a scheduled hearing, shouting accusations that had nothing to do with fact and everything to do with fear. One man surged forward faster than her guards could react, close enough that I felt the heat of his anger before I felt anything else, and it was not a guard who moved between them but me, my hand flat against his chest, my voice low and steady, in a way that surprised even me, telling him plainly that whatever he believed about either of us, this was not the way to say it. He stopped. The guards caught up a half-second later, and the moment ended as quickly as it had begun, but Aurelia did not let go of my arm for the rest of that day, and later that night she told me, quietly, that she had spent 9 years assuming protection, only ever moved in one direction, from alpha to everyone smaller than her, and that watching me step in front of her, without hesitation, had rearranged something fundamental in how she understood the two of us. And there was an evening, quiet and unplanned, when she asked, hesitant in a way the Winter Queen was never permitted to be in public, whether she might scent me, not for any reason beyond wanting to understand why I felt so unbearably, impossibly familiar to a mind missing 9 years of context. I let her press her face briefly to my wrist, her breath warm against my skin, her eyes closing. It was not sexual. It was one of the most intimate things anyone had ever asked of me in my life, and she did not push for more once I gave it, and I loved her a little more for the restraint, even as I hated myself for noticing that I did. The memory came back the way Dr. Celine had warned it might, violently, without warning, triggered by environment rather than convenience. We were in Parliament for a carefully staged, low-risk appearance, meant to reassure the public that the Crown remained functional, and the moment Aurelia crossed the threshold of the chamber where our confrontation had happened, something in her face went white and then entirely blank. She remembered the argument. She remembered finding me afterward in a private corridor, my voice low and furious, telling her she kept calling every cruel choice necessary because she was terrified of admitting she had simply chosen it. She remembered her own cold, precise reply. She remembered watching me walk away down that same corridor, and not following. She withdrew her hand from mine in the car on the ride back to the palace, and I felt the loss of it like something physical, a small amputation I had not braced myself for. "Have you been staying?" she asked, not looking at me, staring instead out the rain-streaked window, "because you feel responsible for the woman who woke up not knowing any better?" "Partly," I said, because it would have been a worse lie to say not at all. "Have you begun falling for me again?" I didn't answer. She took the silence, correctly this time, as confirmation, and I watched shame move through her, swift and total, the same shame I imagined she had once used as fuel for 6 years of composure. "I may have been pressuring you," she said quietly, without meaning to, simply by needing you as much as I have needed you these past weeks. "I would like you to leave the palace, until I understand more of what happened between us. Until I know which parts of what I feel belong to me and which parts belong to the accident." It was the most responsible thing she could have asked of me, and it hurt regardless. Hurt in a way that surprised me with its intensity, given how carefully I had tried to guard against exactly this. My apartment, when I returned to it that evening with a single overnight bag, felt absurdly small and absurdly mine. No guards in the hallway, no marble underfoot, just a kettle that whistled too loudly, and a coat still thrown over the back of a chair from the morning I'd left for what I thought would be a routine hearing. My plants had gone thirsty and reproachful. Nobody called me commissioner every 3 minutes. I told myself I was relieved. I was, and I was also miserable, and I could not decide, lying awake at 2 in the morning, listening to ordinary traffic instead of palace silence. Which version of Aurelia I actually missed most? The girl from the academy who still lived somewhere under the crown, the frightened amnesiac who had needed me with such uncomplicated honesty, or the cold, brilliant queen who had hurt me and might, it now seemed, have been quietly trying to fix it the entire time without telling anyone, including herself. I went back to work. I told my staff at the commission I had been dealing with a family emergency, which was not entirely a lie, and buried myself in a housing discrimination case involving 3 Omega tenants and a landlord who had used bond status to justify eviction. It felt good to fight a battle with clear rules again, clean lines, no palace, no crown, no impossible woman waiting behind marble doors for a version of herself to arrive that I wasn't sure I wanted back. The truth about the registration reform came to Aurelia in pieces, over the weeks that followed, delivered to me in careful, halting phone calls that neither of us acknowledged as anything other than professional updates. It did not entirely absolve her, which I respected more than I expected to. Melis had presented her, 9 years into a reign already built on discipline, with intelligence describing a bond trafficking network, exploiting gaps in the old registration law. Aurelia had believed the emergency legislation necessary. She had known, even then, that my objection had merit. Melis had warned her that weakening the bill's language would cost her a fragile coalition holding together a much larger anti-trafficking package, and Aurelia had chosen the coalition over the warning. She had attacked me publicly, she told me in a small, careful voice over the phone one night, because she believed distancing herself from me visibly would keep her political enemies from using me as a lever against her. It was arrogant. I had never asked to be protected that way, and told her so, more sharply than I intended. Months later, when the law began doing precisely the damage I had warned it would, Aurelia had started drafting the charter in total silence, unwilling to apologize before she had a real solution to offer instead of empty words. The tablet held one more thing, which Eleanor forwarded to me with a note that simply read, "You should see this." An unsent draft message, composed the night of the crash. Not a declaration of love, an apology, and a request that I help her rewrite the law properly, clause by clause, this time with my objections built into the foundation instead of dismissed from a podium. She had been driving north that night, specifically to meet me. We had been hours away from beginning to repair everything when the road gave way beneath her instead. I spent the days before that note arrived going back over the old parliamentary record myself, reading transcripts of the debate I had lost, trying to understand the woman who had beaten me with such precision. I found, buried in a committee footnote nobody had ever reported on, a single amendment Aurelia had quietly introduced and then withdrawn under pressure, an amendment that would have narrowed exactly the clause I'd warned against. She had tried, in her own limited way, inside the system she trusted more than she trusted people, and failed, and told no one she had tried at all, rather than admit the failure. It did not undo what she had done to me on television. It made the whole shape of it harder to hate cleanly, which I resented almost as much as I was moved by it. She did not summon me back to the palace. She sent a handwritten note through Eleanor, asking whether I would be willing to meet her, and I chose the old academy library as neutral ground, and when she arrived, nearly all her memory restored by then, I understood immediately that I was meeting a different woman than the one who had cried against my shoulder during a thunderstorm. Her spine was straighter. Her voice had regained its careful, measured control. 9 years of grief sat behind her eyes where, weeks earlier, there had only been confusion and wonder. "I remember why you hate me now," she said, standing among shelves neither of us had visited in 9 years. "I never hated you," I said. "That would have been so much easier." She told me everything, without flinching this time, standing very still with her hands folded in front of her like she was giving testimony. The coalition, the public attack meant as protection, the charter drafted in secret shame, the years she had used duty as armor against the risk of wanting something as uncertain as me. "When I woke," she said, "I believed you were my mate because my mind had lost everything between wanting you and losing you. It filled the gap with the only conclusion that made the wanting bearable. Now I remember everything. The years apart, the disappointment I caused, what I cost you, professionally and otherwise. And I still want you. But now the wanting belongs to a woman who knows the whole history, not one who's been mercifully spared it. I did not kiss her. I needed more than words, however carefully chosen, however clearly true, and she did not push. And that restraint told me something real about the woman standing in front of me that no speech could have. Melis, sensing Aurelia's memory returning in full, and the Regency Council slipping permanently out of reach, moved against us both within the week. Edited medical records leaked to 3 separate outlets simultaneously. implying I had exploited an impaired monarch, sleeping in the palace, manipulating her through scent, angling quietly for the title of royal consort, shaping legislation from her sickbed while she was too confused to object. None of it was true, and the palace's own logs proved it beyond dispute. I had declined every privilege offered, kept separate accommodation the entire time, refused executive authority at every turn, insisted on independent medical oversight rather than trusting my own account of her condition. Aurelia wanted to release everything immediately, to burn the accusations down with the full weight of the crown behind her. "You do not get to protect me," I told her, by turning my private life into evidence for a courtroom I never agreed to stand in. She stopped, hand still on the phone she had been about to use to summon her press office. I watched her recalibrate in real time, the old instinct to decide unilaterally warring visibly with something newer, something she was still learning to trust. "What do you want me to do?" she asked instead, and I told her plainly. "Release only the palace logs, verified and dated, with no editorializing attached. Let the facts sit in public view, without a single word of royal commentary softening or sharpening them. Allow my own office, not the Crown's press service, to issue any statement about my conduct, because the moment the palace spoke for me, I would stop being an independent commissioner and start being a story the Crown was managing." She listened to the entire list without interrupting, which was, in itself, a kind of answer. And then she did exactly what I had asked, and did not deviate from it once. Not even when a second and uglier wave of leaks arrived 3 days later, suggesting I had used my position to steer the charter's drafting for personal gain. A claim so far from true, it would have been funny under different circumstances. I gave my own statement from the steps of the commission building. No palace officials present, no script approved by anyone but myself. I said that I had spent my career defending the principle that vulnerable people deserve to make their own choices free of coercion. And that principle did not stop applying to me the moment it became personally inconvenient. I said the palace logs would speak for themselves, and that I would not dignify speculation about my private life with further comment. I said, finally, looking directly into the cameras rather than at my notes, that an Omega telling the truth under oath was not evidence of manipulation, and that the country's willingness to assume otherwise said more about the country than it did about me. It was the hardest 2 minutes of public speaking I had ever done, and afterward I sat in my own office with the door closed and shook for the better part of an hour. My own investigation, run quietly through the commission with Eleanor feeding me what she legally could, supplied the rest. I traced the authorization code used to reroute the convoy to an administrative category shared by only 3 senior officials in the entire kingdom, Mayalis among them. Eleanor found the maintenance contractor responsible for the brake module, and I connected that contractor, through public filings anyone could have found if they'd known to look, to a foundation quietly controlled by Mayalis's oldest political allies. A frightened palace accountant handed over payment records under promise of formal protection. A junior technician, terrified and near tears in an interview room she clearly hadn't expected to end up in, admitted she had been ordered to alter the route management system, but swore, repeatedly, that she had never believed anyone would actually be harmed by it. The picture that emerged was not a simple villain's confession, but something colder and more believable, which somehow made it worse. Mayalis had known about the charter's existence, understood exactly what it would destroy, the coalition, the old royal powers she believed essential to national stability, and had engineered an incident serious enough to justify emergency regency, never expecting the crash to be so severe, exploiting Aurelia's memory loss ruthlessly once the accident had already happened and could not be undone. The reckoning came in an extraordinary joint session of Parliament, the chamber packed to its edges, the entire country watching live, most of them expecting Aurelia to defend her fitness to rule by pretending nothing had changed at all. She did the opposite, and it was the bravest thing I had ever watched her do. She stood before them in a plain, dark coat, no crown, no ceremony, and admitted the memory gaps plainly, confirmed she remained under independent neurological monitoring, and voluntarily accepted temporary constitutional limits on her own authority. An admission of vulnerability that, delivered without flinching, without apology, read as strength rather than weakness, in a way that visibly unsettled her opponents. I did not sit beside her as anything resembling a mate. I stood at the witness podium in my capacity as Commissioner for Civic Equality and laid out, piece by piece, exhibit by exhibit, the abuse of the designation Security Authorization System that had made the sabotage possible, the altered route logs, the tampered brake module, the maintenance contractor's ties to Melis's political foundation, the accountant's records, the technician's sworn statement. I addressed, directly and without apology, the prejudice embedded in a public narrative that assumed an Omega must be controlling an Alpha Queen rather than simply telling the truth under oath, and I watched several members of that chamber shift uncomfortably in their seats at hearing it named so plainly. When Melis rose to cross-examine me, she was composed, precise, dangerous in the way I remembered from every account I'd ever heard of her. "Commissioner Senn," she said, "you are, by your own admission, in love with the monarch whose fitness this chamber is currently evaluating. How can this body trust anything you say? Because I have spent 6 years building a career on telling powerful people things they did not want to hear," I said, including, on more than one occasion, Her Majesty herself, in this very chamber, on camera, at considerable professional cost to me. If loving someone made a witness incapable of honesty, half the marriages in this kingdom would be inadmissible in court. A ripple of something. Laughter, maybe, or its more restrained cousin, moved through the gallery. I did not deny loving Aurelia in front of the entire chamber. I told them, instead, that loving someone and lying under oath were not the same act, and that they would find no evidence anywhere in the record that I had ever confused the two. Then Aurelia introduced the Free Bond Charter to the full chamber herself, explained its provisions had been drafted specifically to repair harm caused by legislation she had once publicly defended, and said, in front of every camera in the kingdom, in a voice that did not waver once, "Commissioner Senn warned me this law would cause exactly the harm it has caused." She was right. I was wrong. For a monarch famous for never conceding anything publicly in 9 years of rule, the admission landed on that chamber like an earthquake. I watched grown ministers go pale. Melis was removed from office within the week and placed under formal investigation, her allies scattering before the vote had even fully closed. I did not let myself feel the full weight of any of it until we were alone again, back in the damaged conservatory. No press, no guards inside the glass, ivy still climbing through the broken panes exactly as it had months before. "I remember everything now," she said, standing where the light came through cracked glass in pale, uneven bars. "I know we were never mates. I know we only kissed once, a very long time ago. I know exactly how badly I hurt you, and exactly how much I still love you regardless of any of it. I will never call you mine again, unless you choose that word for yourself, freely, with everything in front of you." The strange thing, I told her, is that the woman who woke up not knowing any of it was easier to love. She had none of the defenses we spent 9 years building against each other. And the woman standing here now, is she impossible to love? "No," I said. "She's just harder." She laughed. A small, real sound, nothing like the composed public laugh she gave at state functions. And I found, without quite deciding to, that I was the one closing the distance between us this time. "Do you know who I am?" I asked her, before anything else could happen between us. She answered with a memory so specific, so entirely and privately mine, that I knew it belonged to 9 years of quiet devotion, rather than any convenient fiction her injured mind had once built for her. "And do you know who you are?" I asked. "Yes," she said, and I believed her completely, and then I kissed her, and it was nothing like the desperate half-formed thing we had shared as terrified 23-year-olds. It was slow and certain, and entirely mutual, her hands finding my face like she was memorizing it on purpose this time. Years of restraint finally allowed to release into something neither of us had to apologize for or hide from anyone. We did not skip to any ending after that. I kept my apartment, and my kettle that still whistled too loudly, and my commission, and my occasional public disagreements with the crown, which the country, to its credit, eventually learned to survive without collapsing into crisis. Aurelia began coming to my apartment without an entourage waiting inside the building, learning, to her genuine and repeated bewilderment, that royal security agents were entirely capable of standing downstairs like reasonable people for an hour at a time. She proved catastrophically bad at grocery shopping, having no working concept of ordinary package sizes, once returning with enough rice to feed a small garrison for a single dinner. I discovered she still left crumbs from midnight toast on every surface within reach, a habit apparently unaffected by 9 years of palace staff. We argued about policy, loudly and often, standing in my kitchen surrounded by books she left in every room out of pure academic instinct. Sometimes I won, sometimes she did. Neither of us treated disagreement as betrayal anymore, which felt, after everything, like the truest measure of how far we had actually come from the mountain road and the medical wing and the frightened woman who had once mistaken safety for certainty. There was a Sunday, unremarkable in every way that mattered, when neither of us had anywhere to be and nothing to prove to anyone. She showed up at my door in ordinary clothes, no security visible on the street, carrying a bag of groceries she had chosen almost entirely at random, and we spent the whole afternoon cooking something neither of us knew how to make properly, arguing cheerfully about whether the recipe card was wrong or we were, the radio playing something neither of us bothered to identify, rain against the windows again, the way it so often seemed to be whenever we were together. Nothing happened. No crisis interrupted it. No headline followed it. No vote depended on it. I remember it more clearly than almost anything else from that entire year, precisely because nothing about it needed remembering except that it was ours. There was a difficult day, months in, when her alpha instincts ran high and unsettled before a difficult rut, and she told me plainly rather than simply arriving at my door and hoping, and I decided, freely, that I wanted to offer her comfort that particular night, and the choice being entirely mine changed everything about how it felt to give it. It was tender, and it was ours, and I will keep the rest of it for myself. Months after that, on an ordinary evening with nothing to celebrate and nothing at stake, no crash anniversary, no political victory, just rain against my apartment windows and a pot of tea gone cold between us, she asked whether I would ever consider a permanent bond. I told her, half laughing, that she had already technically skipped the entire courtship process once, by waking up in a hospital bed and simply announcing we were already mates, and she went red in a way the Winter Queen had never once been photographed doing in 9 years of public life. Then the conversation turned serious, and we spent the better part of that night working through everything that actually mattered. I told her I would not give up the commission, not for her, not for the crown, not for anyone, and she said she would have been alarmed if I'd offered to. I told her I wanted any property that came with a bond to remain entirely in my own name, no palace trust, no royal deed, and she agreed before I had finished the sentence. I told her I would not be called royal consort, or wear a title that implied I answered to anyone but the voters of Valedria and my own conscience, and she said the charter would make certain no title was ever forced on me again, by her or by any monarch who came after her. We talked about medical autonomy, about what would happen if either of us grew sick or injured, about who would speak for whom and under what conditions, and neither of us flinched from any of it, because we had already learned, the hard way, what happens when those questions go unasked. And if it fails, I said finally, watching her across the cooling teapot, if 5 years from now, or 10, we've become people who don't fit each other anymore, what then? Then you leave, Aurelia said, without hesitation, and I do not use a single law in this kingdom to stop you, and I do not let it destroy either of our lives afterward. She reached across the table and took my hand, turning it over slowly, as though she were memorizing the lines of my palm the way she'd once memorized case law. Loving you, she said, near the end of it, quiet and unguarded, means accepting that you could still choose to leave, even now, even after everything. I find I want that risk far more than I ever wanted certainty. I chose the bond that night, not because biology demanded it of either of us, but because for the first time in both our lives, I finally, freely could. We bonded on a quiet evening in early spring, in my own apartment rather than any palace chapel, with no press and no ceremony, beyond the two of us and the small mark that would never fully fade. There was no elaborate ritual. Aurelia asked me, one final time, in plain words, whether I was certain, and I said yes, and she said yes in return, and the moment itself was quieter and less dramatic than either of us might have imagined years earlier, standing in that old conservatory as frightened students who thought love had to announce itself loudly to be real. It didn't. It was her hand steady in mine, and my voice steady in return, and a permanence neither of us had rushed toward and both of us had, in the end, chosen with our whole clear minds. The Free Bond Charter passed into full law within the year, mate bond records protected under real statute for the first time in the kingdom's history, the old law granting a royal mate automatic constitutional standing, abolished for good. That mattered to me more than any ceremony could have. It meant I could belong to her without becoming an office of state, could love a queen without being conscripted into the crown myself. We returned to the restored conservatory a year after the crash, for a scholarship gala held in the very glass room where everything between us had first and then finally begun. When the guests had gone and the lights had dimmed to something soft and private, Aurelia turned to me with the same faint, self-deprecating smile she had worn the day she asked me about dating applications. I was remarkably confident, she said, for a woman missing 9 years of her own life. Confidence was never your problem, I told her. Then what was? Thinking that wanting something gave you enough information to decide what should happen next. She considered that, the old habit of testing an argument for weakness, and found none. What should I do now, then? Ask, I said. May I kiss you? Aurelia asked, and I said yes, freely, with every fact of who we had been and who we had become laid open between us like a door left deliberately unlocked. Standing beneath glass that had survived one winter's damage to hold us both again, I understood, finally and completely, that the accident had never been what made us belong to each other. It had only shown her, for one disoriented and desperate moment, where safety had always lived. Everything that came after, the truth, the reckoning, the slow and difficult choosing, over and over, with full knowledge and every door left open the entire time, was what finally, quietly, made it love.